afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this PESFAX WA webinar. My name is Cindy Webster, and I am the PESFAX WA newsletter editor and project lead. I'll be hosting the webinar today with my colleague Jeanette Pratt as co-host. I'd like to now give an acknowledgement of country. The Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development acknowledges the traditional custodians throughout Western Australia and the continuing connection to the land, waters and community. We pay our respects to all members of the Aboriginal communities and their cultures, and to elders both past and present. In today's webinar, we will have DPED Senior Research Scientist Ian Foster talking about summer rainfall and WA's climate outlook for 2024. DPED Research Scientist Svetlana Micic will then talk about pests that growers need to look out for in 2024. We'll then have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So can you please use the Q&A tool to ask any questions or make comments? The webinar recording will be published on DPED's YouTube channel afterwards for later viewing. I'll now hand over to Ian Foster. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. So what I'll be talking about today, certainly a quick recap of what's happening over summer. Most people will be familiar with what's happened. A quick summary of the rainfall to date this year and some outlooks for late autumn and early winter, and just a bit of a rundown of what's going on with the patterns of atmospheric pressure and sea surface temperatures. And in the next slide, we will see the summer rain. So this is a chart from the Bureau of Meteorology showing rainfall deciles, and that's just a ranking system for the rainfall since November last year until April this year. So you can see that the bulk of the country had a very wet summer or warm season. You've seen in the news, there's been lots of floods and those sorts of things. But for Western Australia, it's been a different story, certainly in a band running from the West Kimberleys down through the Gascoyne and particularly into the lower west coast and southwest. It's been particularly drier than average, and that's extended since probably October as well. There have been some patches in the southeastern grain belt, like around Cool and Hyden, that has had summer thunderstorms. So it's not all, but it's been particularly dry along that southwest and lower west coast area, where in some places it's been lowest on record. And so just the two charts here show, the chart on the left is just the April by itself rainfall deciles, and it's pretty clear that the dry conditions rolled right through April with very little rain. That piled on the agony from the very dry summer. A little bit of rain in the Northwest Cape from a decaying tropical cyclone. The chart on the right is rainfall to date until yesterday in terms of total rain. So early in the month, we'd seen some useful fall, certainly in the southwest and bits of the west and south coast as well. Patchy throughout a lot of the grain belt areas, in the northern grain belt more to the east rather than the coast, and areas of the Esperance district. It's been patchy across there as well. So it's good that there has been this rain. It certainly eased a lot of the issues with on-farm water supplies and the like in the southwest, though they'll still be around for a while, but at least it's nice that it's been starting to rain in reasonable amounts in that part of the world. So what I've got here is from the Bureau of Meteorology. This is looking at the rainfall outlook for periods of time in the future. And the Bureau of Met can look at it month by month, but also in 3 monthly periods. And I've arranged it here where we've got the May rainfall, or that's the outlook is a chart on the left. They're all expressed as the chances of exceeding median rainfall. So the brown colours effectively mean a relatively low chance of exceeding median. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but it seems it's much more likely that that period is likely to be drier rather than wetter. So the left two charts, May and then May, June, July, you can see May is still expected to be drier than normal. May, June, July, the colours there are whitish grey colours, so that says that the outlook is neutral. That is, there's no particular preference towards wetter or drier. So that's actually a better outlook than having brown everywhere. Once you get into June, which is the third chart on the left, the Bureau's model is a bit more enthusiastic about getting rainfall. So the greeny colours means there's a slightly enhanced chance of actually June being wetter than average. So that's certainly an improvement. And then when you look at the June, July, August period on the right hand, that continues that pattern on a bit. So that certainly is the sort of change it's indicating, is that these drier conditions are likely to persist for May, but we start to see a change from June onwards. So that's certainly good, and that's a relief from what the outlooks were expecting last year. The other bit to note is that the temperature outlooks are consistent for the whole period of being much, much warmer than normal. So that has implications in that let's say in June, you might start to get some reasonable rain, but it's likely to be warmer than average. And that's soil temperature as well as air temperature. So that's a feature of this year. They're just expecting warmth everywhere all the time. So these three charts are just from some international models. It's just a quick confirmation that the Bureau's model is not all by itself. The top two charts are from a European site, the Copernicus site, where they scoop up together a whole set of models. They've got about 8 in each of those charts. It's just the chances of exceeding median. And they're both showing a similar pattern. The white bit across the continent actually is quite good. It means the models have got no particular preference towards wetter or drier, though it's clearly got a preference for drier off Indonesia in both of those periods. The one on the left is May, June, July, and the other one is June, July, August. That's probably coming from a thing I'll describe later on from the Indian Ocean dipole that's expected. The chart on the bottom is from a Korean multi-model assembly, same sort of spatial pattern. So the purpose about that is that we're getting, again, consistency in these periods where the models are describing things in terms of the spatial patterns. So that gives you some confidence, I guess, that the way the atmosphere and the oceans are evolving at least has some consistency. Now, one of the drivers behind that is what's happening to the sea level pressure distribution. Now, the chart on the left is the forecast mean sea level pressure for May, June, July this year. This is from the Bureau of Met's model. Now, these are deviations from average. So anywhere that's coloured the red, dark, purpley sort of magenta sort of colour, the pressure for that period is likely to be higher than average, or the model's expecting it that way. And the bluey bits, you've guessed it, are likely to be lower than average pressure. The chart on the left is actually showing a classic thing called a wave train, where you've got a low, high in the southern hemisphere, and they're very strong anomalies as well, as shown by the very, very dark colours. That's potentially an example of a thing called a teleconnection coming out of the tropics, where it's been abnormally warm in the Western Indian Ocean just off East Africa. And that potentially is sending a signal down into the higher latitudes, just where we're sitting. So that's the primary drive. Those high pressure cells mean that it doesn't mean it'll always be high pressures. It just means once a cold front goes through, then it very quickly gets replaced by another high pressure cell. And potentially it means they're relatively slow moving as well. When you get to June, July, August, you see the colours a bit more muted. The high pressure belt shifted a bit more in the Australian region, and with the area of low atmospheric pressure starting to approach the WA coast. So that suggests that the weather systems are likely to have an easier chance getting in from June onwards. So it's just trying to illustrate that the models are not just a black box. There's processes going on behind them, and they're physical processes of heat and momentum within the atmosphere and the ocean. So this is now looking at sea surface temperatures. So this is the prediction from the Bureau of Meteorology's Access model for June, July, and August. Again, difference is showing at the sea surface temperatures difference from average, where first bit to note, there's a lot of red on this map, and global oceans are just about the warmest since we've been observing it. You'll notice a couple of bluey bits, which imply that the oceans there are likely to be warmer than average. The first one is in the eastern Pacific off South America. So that's the signature of a potential La Nina event. A couple of caveats with that. Not all the models are expecting that sort of thing. They're doing it differently. Some are more enthusiastic than others. Also, this time of year, the predictability, that is the ability of the models to predict these things is relatively poor. So you maybe need to take that with a bit of a grain of salt. After June, the predictability improves a lot. So we'll see how they go for that. The other bit of interest is in the tropical Indian Ocean. So that's the bit between Indonesia and Africa. And you see there's a dark red bit off Africa, Saudi Arabia, one of the reasons why the airport got flooded out a few weeks ago. But a cooler region off Sumatra. Now, that particular pattern is indicative of an Indian Ocean dipole event. And all the dipole event means one bit's warmer and one bit's cooler. That's all. So there's nothing fancy about that particular name. They've defined it as a positive event is that if it's cooler off Indonesia and warmer off Africa. So the models seem to be consistent in expecting that. It's unusual to get 2 in a row, like we had one last year. It's also a bit unusual to have it if there's a La Nina. But as the oceans are changing things, and now we have to realise that some of the old patterns won't necessarily be repeated. We're getting into some new territory. So just on the next slide, I'll do a final bit just describing what's meant by an Indian Ocean dipole in a tiny bit more detail. So this is, again, a map. There's Australia in the bottom right, Africa on the left. The regions there, this is a pattern the models are expecting this year, where it tends to be cooler in the Indonesian region and warm off Africa. The grey lines simulate the east-west circulation of tropics. So off Africa, Saudi Arabia, that sort of thing, when it's like that, they get abnormally wet conditions, which has been happening. They've been getting floods in Kenya, I think, recently as well. But on the other side of it, over Indonesia, you tend to get a bit more sinking air, and that tends to suppress the rainfall. And that spills over into Australia as well, in that it just means the chance of that winter and spring rainfall tends to be reduced a bit. So that's the pattern that was expected by the models. The next one will pull up the other mode. Thank you. So this is what happens. These tend to be associated with wetter conditions across a lot of southern Australia. So it's the same sort of thing. So this is what's called a dipole. It's just swapped over. So the waters of Africa are cooler, but the waters around Indonesia are warmer. And in the tropics, the convection and the rainfall goes where the ocean warms. So it tends to, so in this case, the convection tends to be concentrated around Indonesia, and that does spill over into Australia. So that's the two opposite phases. And then I've also got a neutral phase when nothing much is going on, which happens a fair bit. So that's just a bit of a background to what's meant by the Indian Ocean dipole. It tends to have a bit more of an impact on WA than El Nino or La Nina does. So just to note, there's some background to this. Again, it's not just guesswork within the models. They are simulating these sorts of processes. And the reason why this is important, in a sense, in that once the model once the oceans warm up or cool down, they take a long time to change because there's a lot of heat capacity. So these are what's known as slow-moving components. They'll take several months to evolve, and they'll take several months to go away. Whereas with the weather systems we'd see on the charts, they come and go within a week or two. So they're sort of they're shorter-term, faster-moving atmospheric components. Whereas this is a bit that's a slower-moving bit, and this is a thing that tends to shove things around for seasons. So just a message of that, you're pretty familiar that it's very dry conditions over summer and into autumn. The early May rain has been useful in some areas, though in lots of places there's still very poor soil moisture. Some crops have emerged already, but the obvious interest is for follow-up. The rain outlooks indeed do improve from June, so that's good. And finally, as far as those sort of major drivers are concerned, an IOD positive Indian Ocean dipole is possible, though the caveat is that the models have less skill at this time of year, even though they do tend to agree on this thing. So that bit there is a bit of a watch this space to see how it evolves. And so thank you, Cindy. That's all for this part.
Thank you very much, Ian. And now we're on to looking at what we can expect from pests for this season. So we're looking at our fly-in, fly-out pests, the ones that aren't present in our paddocks year in, year out. Those are our resident pests. So based on what Ian's just talked about, we're going to look at what our predictions are for 2024. So last year in 2023, we got quite a few reports of red-legged earth mite causing damage to quite established canola. So we had canola at the 10-leaf stage being quite severely retarded by red-legged earth mites. One of the reasons for this is that growers weren't expecting hatching times to occur when they did. So I thought we might just go through what the red-legged earth mite life cycle is, just to refresh everybody. So don't forget, red-legged earth mites hatch when we've had at least a rainfall event of 5 mils and 10 days of temperatures below 19 degrees. Now, usually this happens in April, but it doesn't matter when it happens because the red-legged earth mite females back in October died with diapause eggs inside them. The cadaver of the female protects these eggs from a hot, dry summer. So even if we've had an extended summer or a warmer than average autumn, we can still expect those eggs to be viable and to hatch. The issue this year is with a lot of crops that have gone in dry is that the crop germination may coincide with peak hatching of red-legged earth mites. So CSER Australia have just run a model for us, looking at where we have hatchings that have occurred or will occur in WA. So as of today, the areas in pink have hatched 2 weeks ago. Areas in grey hatched last week. So I ran this model last week and that grey area wasn't there. And the green is what we expect to hatch in the next 2 weeks. Now, everyone can access this model by going onto the web page here on the screen. You just type in your location, click estimated hatch, and your predicted timing of hatching will appear. Now, as you can see here, as of 2 days ago, the temperature conditions in Katanning and rainfall conditions weren't conducive to hatching of red-legged earth mites. But if you look at West River, the red-legged earth mites peak hatching is expected to occur next week. So this is a really good tool just to give an indication of when peak hatching of red-legged earth mites do occur. Now, just bear in mind that in a paddock, we do have areas of paddocks that do hatch earlier than others. So it's a really good idea to monitor paddocks, not just at one spot, but throughout. Another thing that we had lots of reports of last year was of red-legged earth mites that survived insecticides. A department with a GRDC co-investment project led by CSER Australia is again undertaking resistance testing in red-legged earth mites. But I thought I'd share you the results that we had in 2023. So out of the 62 populations that we tested, 92% were resistant to synthetic pyrethroids. Now, a red-legged earth mite population that's resistant to synthetic pyrethroids is resistant to all synthetic pyrethroids, and that resistance is heritable. So it will persist in those areas. Each year, we also look at the organophosphates chlorpyrifos and omethylate. Last year of the populations that were resistant to synthetic pyrethroids, 25% were also resistant to chlorpyrifos, and the same 25% were also resistant to omethylate. So the chlorpyrifos is the round circles, omethylate is the grey crosses, and you can see there's no grey crosses by themselves, which is very different because in previous years we've always had omethylate resistance by itself. This is one of the first years where we don't have omethylate resistance by itself and only a single population of chlorpyrifos resistance. What this means is those growers that do have SP resistance and tolerances to chlorpyrifos and omethylate in their red-legged earth mite populations are really limited in what they can use to control their red-legged earth mites. There's only one insecticide, diaphenthioron receptor, that will be able to be used. However, you do need green plant material. It's a growing concern. So in 2024, we again are undertaking red-legged earth mite resistance testing, and we strongly encourage that if you've had any spray failures in 23, to please contact us here at the PestFacts team to get your populations tested. The red-legged earth mite resistance management strategy is a good tool to look at, to really, if you don't have resistance, to try and avoid getting it, because once we get resistance in red-legged earth mites, it's quite difficult to manage. And just bear in mind that anyone that does have resistance in red-legged earth mites has resistance not because they sprayed for red-legged earth mites per se, but because they were spraying for other pests, and the red-legged earth mites just happened to get a dose. So really, if you are spraying, please rotate your insecticides, especially if you're spraying for pests other than redlegs. One thing with Ian saying that we're expecting a warmer than average winter is that even though we've had a very dry summer, our pests such as Borobia mite, brown wheat mite and Balaustia mite tend to only be an issue when we have a green bridge and then we have them moving on to germinating crops. But brown wheat mite and Borobia mite do thrive in warmer conditions. And just bear in mind that if you do see brown wheat mite, it looks just like a Borobia mite. The front legs are quite long, but it's only on cereals. Borobia mite is really only on canola. So it's just a semantics, but please bear in mind and get your and only control them if the crop is not able to outgrow the feeding damage. Valostium mite is really only an issue for crops at germination or if cereal crops are quite moisture stressed, but do check to see if there's rain, because if there's rain, the crop readily outgrows the damage. But one thing that we did get quite a few growers having issues with last year was lucerne flea, and lucerne flea females coat their eggs in clay, and those eggs can survive hot, dry summers quite readily, and they will hatch with a rain event. But please bear in mind that you do get staggered hatchings of lucerne flea, and it really doesn't matter what the temperature is. These little critters can do quite a bit of damage to a germinating crop, and if peak hatching occurs to an established crop, you really do need to look at your controls. The department has got some automated pitfall traps located from port zones from Gelton to Albany, and we're looking at predicting the timing of hatching for lucerne flea. So at the moment, none of our automated pitfall traps are picking up lucerne flea, and as soon as we do, the results will be shared through PestFacts and through X, otherwise known as Twitter. One of the things that we have been getting quite a few reports about and quite a few calls is slugs and snails. Both these pests will survive a hot, dry summer quite easily. Slugs, just because it's been hot and dry, doesn't mean that they're dead. They will survive very nicely. One of the biggest issues that we've got with slugs is that you need good rainfall throughout the paddock for them to start moving and actively moving, because over summer they burrow under the ground and coat themselves in mucus, which keeps them nice and moist throughout summer. And it's really only when that mucus layer gets broken down by moisture that they start to become active and to start moving. Now, we do say bait straight after seeding for slugs, but bear in mind that if the slugs emerge as the crop emerges, the baits, as you can see here in the red circles on the picture on the right, do then compete with green plant material to be attractive to slugs. So keep an eye out on slugs, because you only need 1 per square metre to cause damage to a germinating canola crop. However, for snails, our round snails are a lot easier to control than our conical. We've got round snails right now in the Esperance port zone, which are laying eggs. The caveat here is that egg lay is occurring in areas in paddocks where the snails have been actively feeding on green plant material. To date, no eggs have been found anywhere where there hasn't been a green plant material present, but the agronomists that have been and the growers that have been baiting in the Esperance port zone for round snail have found that they've got some really good results with baiting right now. The small pointed snail, though, is a little bit more problematic. So all I can say is budget for more than 1 bait for these critters, because they are a little bit more difficult to control. There are a few projects looking at the timing of baiting to get it right to stop egg lay for next year. So to stop egg lay, you need to kill the snail before they lay eggs, and they start to lay eggs when the albumin gland becomes fully developed. The albumin gland provides the nutritious fluid required for egg lay. And Sterling's to Coast farmers have coordinated dissections from the Esperance to Albany port zones, and they're looking at the increase in gland length and also looking at whether or not snails have got food in their guts. So what we know is that the areas in green is where we've found snails actively feeding. It's a really good idea to patch bait in those areas. If the snails are feeding and you're getting a good kill on your conical snails, bait your entire paddock. We are seeing their glands slowly increasing in the North Albany areas as well as to the Esperance East area. So egg lay still hasn't occurred, but it is a really good time to bait if the snails are actively moving and actively feeding. The other thing that Seppwa located in Esperance and SCF located in the Albany Port Zone are actively looking at cameras and seeing where snails are moving. We're finding that snails are actively moving in the Esperance and Albany Port Zone, though with the drier conditions during the day, they're not getting any movement. It's really only at night, and especially where there's been a spike in moisture, i.e. a rainfall event, that we're getting movement. Watch out for updates on X and on PestFacts just to see when snails are moving. That's a really good way of making sure that you're baiting when they're moving, because they're more likely to find a bait. Don't forget that when you do bait, good even baits across paddocks work the best, because the more even the bait is, the spread of baits are, the more likely it is that the snail will encounter the bait. One thing that we did get quite a few reports of last year was Desiantha weevil, but not so much from the other weevil species. That's maybe just because of the fact that we've got 2 summers in a row where we've had low rainfall and not much of a green bridge. Vegetable weevil does prefer its host plant to be capeweed. Lucerne weevil, of course, as its name suggests, does prefer lucerne. But we do have a little project looking at Desiantha weevil, because we've got quite a few reports in PestFacts of spray failures for Desiantha weevil, and we do have automated pitfall traps in paddocks with Desiantha, looking at when they're actively moving, because we suspect that it might be the timing of the sprays that's the issue. We're also looking at trials on the larvae of the Desiantha weevil to look at whether its host range is just cereals, as has been previously found in WA, or whether the agronomists who are finding what looks like Desiantha weevil in paddocks such as canola it is actually Desiantha weevil. We don't know if they're actually able to complete their life cycle on canola, so stay tuned to PestFacts and we'll be able to tell you more. But if you do find paddocks with Desiantha weevil, please let us know. And for those of you that have been madly looking at this picture on the right, trying to find the Desiantha weevil in the picture from an automated pitfall trap, it's just located up here in the orange circle in the top left. With Ian predicting a warmer winter, don't forget that vegetable beetle will feed if temperatures are above 18 degrees. This particular beetle is quite difficult to kill with any registered insecticides, so please only control absolutely if necessary. Baits that are registered for earwigs will have some efficacy on this beetle, but if the crop is going to outgrow the damage, I'd suggest leaving it alone because it's so hard to kill. And talking about European earwigs, we have had, don't forget, European earwigs do survive quite happily over summer, and even though there's no green in the paddock, they're one of our very few pests which are predatory as well as feeding on green plant material. So it's a pest that doesn't really need a green bridge to thrive. If they were in your paddocks last year, you can expect them in their right now in the paddocks, and so it's better to control them earlier rather than later, especially before crop damage occurs. To date, I haven't really mentioned the fly-in, fly-out pests. They're the ones that fly into our paddock. Most of these pests that we have issues with occur due to a green bridge and the proximity of a green bridge to a germinating canola crop. However, with warmer than average conditions, we can expect to have pests or insects in paddocks that we've never seen before. So if you see something and you don't know what it is, please take a photo and submit it to PestFacts. The PestFacts Reporter app will be up soon, and you can use that as soon as it's up and running again. But realistically, we do rely on anyone that's out there. If you find something and don't know what it is, please take a photo. It may be something of interest or it might not be, but we definitely need your eyes on the ground. However, even though we haven't had a green bridge over summer, with the warmer than average conditions expected in winter, we can expect that some of our aphids may be an issue. So bear in mind that our cereal aphids, those will survive quite happily on any of our native grasses or introduced grasses, which can survive hot, dry summers, and that their life cycle does get quicker from a nymph to adult. the warmer it is. So do keep an eye out on aphids, and realistically, please only spray if you absolutely need to. And one of the main reasons for that is we, as an industry, are seeing less and less insecticides that are becoming available to us. And one of the projects we've got going on is the Canola Allies project, which is looking at the impact beneficials have on our pest populations, and just to see how much downward pressure our beneficials do provide to pests. We're not saying that they're going to control a pest population that's exploding, but we're looking at how much impact they actually do have, and we'll be reporting the results through PestFacts. But another thing that you might like to consider is that if you do need to apply an insecticide, there is a toxicity table developed by CSER Australia, which lists how toxic some of the insecticides are on the off-target pests, of the off-target beneficials, and that might be something you would like to consider. And if you're not sure what the insect is, do take a photo, because we do get quite a few carabid beetles in paddocks, and they can be present in quite high numbers, though usually they're very fast running. So rule of thumb, if it's a fast running beetle, it might be a good guy. So please, if you've got any questions or answers, Cindy's coming online.
Thanks very much, Svet. Please, we have had some questions come in. And for those that might be thinking of a question as we speak, please use the Q&A tool to ask them. So our first question was for Svetlana. Do you have any comment on high temperatures forecast by Ian on the pest population growth rates? I think you mentioned the vegetable beetle gets active above 18 degrees Celsius. Are there other pest populations that might go a bit crazier if it gets a bit warmer?
So we do have quite a number of moths, like the diamondback moth, which also has a quicker life cycle the warmer it is. Without having had a green bridge throughout our landscape, the risk is low for germinating crops, but definitely as the season does progress, we do expect late winter, early spring that we may have, if that's warmer than usual, that diamondback moth could possibly be an issue. The wet conditions that Ian showed in the maps, as you would have seen in summer, especially in the areas outside of our grain growing regions, have led to an influx and an increase in populations of pests such as the Australian plague locust, but we don't anticipate that those populations will be moving into our broadacre growing areas.
Thanks, Svet. Our second question, another insect one. What is the current thinking for the optimal time to spray Desiantha weevil?
So right now, Desiantha weevil are a pest that does cause damage to germinating canola. We've always said to spray when the weevils are actively moving, and the reason behind this is that during the day they're quite cryptic, hidden under stubble, and can survive sprays of alpha-cypermethrin quite readily. However, what we're finding with our pitfall trapping is that even though we've said spray late in the afternoon when they're more active, is that may not be quite right, that they're actually active quite a lot later in time period. So right now, the paddocks that we're monitoring, the weevils have only become active as the rains have occurred. So stay tuned.
And Svet, I have got another insect question, and then I'm going to go to Ian with a climate question. It's related to the Desiantha weevil. It might be a comment, it could be interpreted as a question. Also, the spray fails reported on Desiantha weevils. I assume they were using brews considered effective on vegetable weevil.
No. So they've been using registered rates for the Desiantha weevil, and to date, the bioassays we've done where we've used those same rates and exposed the Desiantha weevil to vials coated with different rates of alpha-cypermethrin, what we found is that there's been no tolerance to alpha-cypermethrin, so it's probably is a timing issue and the insect actually isn't coming into contact with the chemical.
Thanks, Svet. And Ian, Moving on to you. Last year, you predicted a dry season, which we saw in most areas, but there are a couple of areas that were wetter than expected. Can you explain why this is and why the models didn't predict this?
Yes, thanks, Cindy. Yes, some areas in the south did have a sort of wetter than expected by the models, and that's just a classic example of how weather events can not so much come out from left field, but they're not necessarily simulated in such a detail by the seasonal models. And so what the seasonal models do is that they are initialized at different times. And by initialized, it means you get a snapshot of what the atmosphere and the ground and the ocean looks like. And then they evolve the models forward in time for several months. But they don't just do it once, they do it several times in what's known as an ensemble approach. So what you get from the seasonal outlook is not just one future, it's the statistical description of what the futures might look like. So it's still a pretty broad brush thing. And where they're driven by is those slow moving components I mentioned before, such as if there's a very large pattern, particularly strong sea surface temperature pattern, for example. So the weather events are things that happen in the order of 1 to 2 weeks or so. So they can quite easily come, and if it gives you exceptionally wet conditions, it can mean that it can give you rain where the overall seasonal outline wasn't expecting it. And I guess the important thing is that the seasonal outlook is a description of probabilities or chances of stuff happening. It's not the only outcome. So that's just an example that the longer term models, they're dependent on having those slow moving components to give them some predictability in future months. They're also susceptible to these shorter term events coming through and changing what happens on the grounds as opposed to what the models were expecting. So they're certainly not perfect. You're never going to get a thing like that where it gives you an unvarying, unchanging roadmap of how the season unfolds. It's always going to be that sort of uncertainty. So that's why you blend this idea of these longer term events, which are sort of like guidance, certainly rather than gospel, with the shorter term week to 10-day outlooks, which certainly have quite a high degree of predictive skill now with the state which models have got. So you're sort of blending these two things as well.
Thank you, Ian. And now we're moving on to our final question of the webinar, it seems. So Svetlana, this one's aimed for you again. A comment, feedback, a great presentation. Thank you. I was wondering if you have any advice on how growers can prioritise planning of pest management of crop emergence this year. As with the dry start to the season, many growers have sowed most of their seeds, so many paddocks and crop types will be coming up all at once instead of staggered, which may be a challenge for planning of pest management.
That would be an absolute challenge for planning for pest management. And this has occurred in the past, where you would have seen that picture at the very beginning of the slide where you've got canola with indiscriminate chewing damage and you can't find anything anywhere. All I can suggest is a few pitfall traps in the ground, which is a cup in the ground with a little bit of water will tell you what's actively moving in the landscape. And it gives a quick way of being able to assess whether you've got pest issues. It's not the best for detecting slugs and snails, but hopefully you've got historic information on those. And this is where it gets difficult because the requirement to monitor it when you've got a germinating crop and also predicted warmer than average autumn conditions does mean that we might get some moisture stressed crops out there, and a little bit of chewing damage or a little bit of damage can cause retardation of the crop. So all I can suggest is that growers and agronomists don't just look at crop edges, really go into the middle of your crops because that's where we've had issues in the past. And really look at doing some smart monitoring. So put pitfall traps in the ground and do the best you can, but really keep an eye on that germination because any of the insecticides that have been applied post-seeding, pre-emergence probably have done their job of what was there then and isn't going to control what's here now.
Thank you both, Ian and Svet, for answering those questions. And to the audience, if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to email us on pestfactswa@dperd.wa.gov.au, and I will forward them to Svet or Ian or address them as appropriate. As mentioned before, the webinar recording will be put on DPERD's YouTube channel for you to view at your leisure and share as you wish. And please feel free to follow at DPERD Broadacre on X, formerly Twitter, for our Pest Facts WA posts as we report what's happening in the landscape during the season. And just to follow onto our final slide of the webinar, we'd like to thank you all very much for attending today's webinar. I'd like to thank Ian and Svetlana for presenting, and to Jeanette Pratt for co-hosting. The Pest Facts WA team hopes to hear from you soon with any of your broadacre insect or plant disease queries or reports that you may have during the season. But we'll say a goodbye for now, and we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Goodbye, everyone.